Wonderful.
Yeah,
Um, so maybe we can just get started. Now I have forgotten that this is already being recorded. I went and tried to
I
record,
know.
and I was like, it's already going.
It's already
Um,
happening.
Hello there. Welcome to the Good.Enough.Shrink podcast. We are your hosts. I am Jenna Chang, a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist practicing here in Los Angeles, California.
And I'm Dr. Patrick Kelly. I am also a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist practicing in the Los Angeles area.
We are on a mission to demystify child psychiatry and have conversations surrounding difficult topics on youth and adult mental health, but not without a little play along the way.
Welcome to the podcast.
We are delighted to have you here listening to us talk about some topics that we think are interesting, that we hope you'll find interesting.
Absolutely. And so a little bit about the motivation and inspiration for this podcast. For the majority, I think this is for us to keep in touch with the latest research, updates, and all the things going on in youth mental health. But the other side is really to demystify child psychiatry as a field. I think there's a lot of questions and uncertainties and maybe fears surrounding this field. And on top of that, there's a pretty significant rise in youth mental health issues. And so we want to recruit as many people as possible to join together in this fight.
So we're going to be talking about a lot of different topics, a wide range, and some of these are topics that are more recent, some are more established, but a lot of the things that are interesting are almost by definition, I wouldn't say controversial, but have different thoughts about it. So we're going to be talking about our views when they are backed up by evidence. We'll certainly say that, but this is also not meant to be individual medical advice for you. If you have more specific questions, always see your own provider. This is not meant to globally say that it represents the thinking of all psychiatrists throughout the nation. These are our thoughts and our discussions about different topics and how we see them.
And our views are our own, and they don't represent any other institutions or organizations, and we have no conflict of interest. And so, importantly for this podcast, one of the major themes that we want to focus on is to emphasize the power of holding difficult emotions from the lens of attachment theory. Attachment theory is something that's been pretty profound for me. It has changed the way I approach practice in general. And it's based on this idea that, did you know, Dr. Kelly, that baby elephants can walk within an hour of birth?
I did not. That's really interesting.
Yeah, like within the hour after they're born, they can start to kind of wiggle their legs and get up, and then they're following the herd within a couple hours. And so when I put that into perspective compared to human beings, we need a year, not an hour, a year to walk. So the first bond that a baby forms is very, very important. And because of this, that we need care and nurture throughout the early years of life. And so sort of the initial question is, what really happens in the first moments of life? We can kind of inherently feel that there's a motivation to survive. And then after that, what maintains that sort of motivation to survive as the child develops? And there's different schools of thought. In child development and child psychology, there's two very different views, and then attachment theory came in and attempted to integrate a lot of things together. But it essentially starts with psychoanalysts who focused on fantasies, internal conflicts, and the unconscious, and the development of the ego. That kind of thinking dominated child psychology early in 1900s. And in the mid 1900s, 1950s, and later on, behaviorists came on board, and they wanted to focus on more of the action component, the behavior, and what reinforces behavior, positive reward and what reduces negative outcomes. There was a little bit of shift from the internal world to the external world. Attachment theory then sort of came in and proposed this entirely different motivational system, that it's not just about something purely internal, it's not just about something purely external, but there's a motivational system that's based on a social bond with another. And this helped, I think, people sort of understand that there's more to life than feeding, mating, procreating, that kind of thing. There's meaning. And a lot of times we weren't able to put words to what makes life meaningful, or what is the point of all these emotions and experiences and interpersonal connectedness. So attachment emphasized that, highlighted that, and said that that was an important part of life. And the Harvard Grant Study, which is this huge 80-year study that followed these Harvard students into their older adulthood, this was one of the longest running research studies that's ever been conducted. I think it's still ongoing, actually. And they essentially wanted to know what makes life happy, what makes someone's life happy. The Atlantic wrote this article a few years ago about the general conclusion of the study, which was that the greatest impact of life and its satisfaction is in the warmth and quality of the relationships that surround you. And so these relationships that we have, they're uniquely human. The complexity of these relationships, the loyalty, the devotion that you can feel from a parent or a friend or a partner can really make or break someone's quality of life. And in addition, kind of bringing us back into the present moment, is that the US Surgeon General recently published papers that stated that loneliness is officially a public health crisis, and it can in fact lead to 29% increase in the risk of heart disease, 32% increase in the risk of stroke, and 50% increase in the risk of developing dementia for older adults. And so therefore, this lacking of this social connection really increases general premature risk of death by more than 60%. I mean, that is just sort of mind-boggling to me. But what are your thoughts, Dr. Kelly?
That is really amazing, both that it has such a profound impact, and frankly, that people are now paying attention to it. I think this is an aspect of the field, like you were talking about, Dr. Cheng, that has been sort of around and discussed and talked about and known about since the 1900s in a codified way. But only recently did the major medical influencer professional of the United States actually come out and say how important it is and back that up. So it's been over 100 years that we've been thinking about this and acting on it somewhat, but not as sort of profoundly. And it could be argued that things like the COVID pandemic, things that impose that sort of social isolation, really bring to the forefront how important something like that truly is, and that it's not just a background element that can be compensated for in different ways, that it's a crucial component of well-being. And the templates for all of those relationships and connections start in the very first hours, years of life. And that's why attachment is such an important component of the discussion and of what we talk about, because those patterns, those sort of internalized ideas of how relationships are supposed to look and how they function really do carry forward forever in a way, because as infants, we need those relationships literally to survive. We can't get along without them. And so they're the single most important thing in our life. So all of our learning folds around that. And so it makes sense that is something that stays with us and not something that goes away, but that it is something that is changeable, that we can look at and we can evaluate and we can sort of pull apart in different ways and try to do different things with, if that's something that someone wants to look at and someone wants to change.
Yeah. Yeah. It's actually making me think about the ACE study as well, the Adverse Childhood Events Experience study. Now that I'm thinking about it, it really is pervasive in a way, these kinds of early attachment trauma that can happen. And we can certainly go into that. But before we delve into that, I do think it's important to kind of understand child psychiatry and psychology from a historical perspective. And I am always a history junkie when it comes to sort of how things have evolved. I always want to understand what has led to this. And so
And even
start
the differences between those two terms. I mean, I think a lot of people, unless you're really in the field, they don't really think about or understand or contemplate the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist and what that looks like and what those words even mean and what we study. And a lot of that is historical, and we can talk about that, right? So psych is mind, and ology is the study of. So psychologists study the mind. It's the study of the mind. You can get a PhD in it. You can spend your life studying the mind. Not the brain, those are neurologists, but the mind itself and its workings. And psychiatry is the treatment of. So so in medicine, sort of people who go through medical school and become internal medicine doctors or pediatricians or psychiatrists, the way that word came about, it's people who treat the mind, whereas people who get a master's degree and then a PhD and do research and evaluate and do testing are ologists. They're people who study the mind. Now, obviously, those terms have merged, and the line is not nearly as distinct. Many psychologists don't really participate in any research and are primarily clinicians and do treatment of mental conditions. And there are many psychiatrists who are pure researchers, and that's how they spend their career, is with study and application and different development. So I think today it's more about the type of training you had and the type of treatment that you give, that by and large, and it's different in different places, but psychiatrists mostly are the practitioners who manage medication in addition to diagnosis and treatment and psychotherapy, whereas psychologists, for the most part, and this is changing and changeable, psychologists don't manage medications. They really are more invested in psychotherapy and therapeutic treatment and talk therapy. And that can be for individuals, that can be for organizations, that can be in different scales. But I think it's an important distinction to have. And honestly, I think it's important enough that we'll probably talk about it more throughout different episodes. But that's an introduction.
Yeah, that's so important. Thank you for bringing that up. So yeah, when all of this started, the concern was for children who were neglected, abandoned, abused, homeless. And so essentially in the early mid 1800s, in the United States, there were reformers who, actually mostly women, interested in improving the well-being of these children. And they started this movement, which, I had really never really heard about until I really looked into this, called the Orphan Train Movement. It was from 1854 to 1929. This was a welfare program supported by wealthy donors who had very much a lot of concern for these children who were neglected. And they ended up transferring about 200,000 children from eastern cities of the United States into foster homes in the Midwest. And this was an attempt to really improve the living conditions. However, this is actually a problem we still have to this day, that a lot of foster homes were not appropriately managed. There was abuse going on, and it wasn't the best situation, but it was better than living in the slums of the city and not having any food, water. It was better, but it was not perfect. And so by the late 1800s, this is after 50 years or so, this then became a full-fledged movement, a child-saving movement. And it led to essentially ending child labor, promoting education as a requirement for every child. You have to go to school. And also did wonderful things like provide school lunches, leading to government-sponsored agencies to really support these abandoned, neglected, homeless children.
It's really
What was
interesting to look back in history at sort of where we've come from and where we are. I mean, even the word orphan, when you say
mm,
that, it has, certain connotation. And thinking about, it used to be that if you're 6 years old and you don't have a home or food, go get a job, find somewhere to
mm,
work. We'll feed you, but it's not free. I mean, just the idea that we didn't think about how to care for and protect kids at the same time as people were starting to think about attachment and how important that was and how kids are not born knowing how to take care of themselves. It's such a sort of dissonance in what we were doing
mm,
versus how certain people thought about things. And I think to an extent we're still going through that. Um,
mhm.
so so yeah, I think and in this podcast, I think we enjoy taking an unflinching look at what we did in the past and what wasn't great, and how we can use that to do better now.
Yeah, it's important to not lose sight of the fact that there was a lot of effort in trying, and yet we've made mistakes, and we have to own that. And
Hmm.
so actually, the other thing that's really just fascinating to me is, I mean, we're talking about like early 1900s. This is like 100 years
Of the last 200,000 years of human history.
but in the last 100 years or so, we're starting to finally say, hey, let's take care of kids, make sure that that they're not working at the age of 11 and they're going to school and getting education, getting food. I mean, it's pretty recent stuff in the grand scheme of things.
Hmm.
And in 1912, actually, was the kind of a landmark year where the US federal government created the Children's Bureau, which conducted research and implemented child welfare programs for the first time, supported by the government. And in 1921, so about 10 years later, the federal government then funded a preventative health care for mothers and children, again, for the first time. And so this is just very recent, finally, support kicking in for children and families.
And I do think that was an important realization and coming together of a couple of ideas. One was that children are important and can't take care of themselves, and so we need to take care of them in some ways through things like the orphan train and protection, but also more. I don't want to necessarily say modern, but ideas that we certainly know are true now, that sometimes one of the best ways you can take care of a child is to take care of their parent and their guardian and to give their parent the breadth
Mhm.
and the ability to care for them well. So, taking care of, in this case, the mother, the primary caregiver at the time, was actually the most effective and best way to care for the child. And I think that that's still something that we think about and to an extent struggle with.
Yes. It's hard to balance not blaming the parent versus understanding that there's a very intricate link between the parent and the child. And so,
And that is, by the way, an important thing that I think we should say right at the outset. That,
mhm,
I've certainly heard when we talk about attachment, when people talk about attachment, that there's a quick assumption to, oh, so it's all the parent's fault, right? That
mhm,
all of pathology, all of anything that happened wrong for the rest of the child's life is based on that first relationship and everything the parents screwed up as they were starting out this kid along their life. That is not the message. That is not what we're saying. In fact, there's a very famous pediatrician who came up with what we now think of as a very famous saying, the good enough parent, that yes, there is some pathology, there is some trauma that can come about. But for most people, it's about doing the best you can and having a healthy attachment, whatever that is, sort of like a healthy diet versus a perfectly optimized diet. And that, yes, taking care of parents and allowing them to do the best by their kid is helpful, but you know, one mistake, not walking into the room immediately when a kid cries, or walking in too soon when a kid cries, or not feeding them when you're supposed to, or feeding them too frequently, or all of those little things are not what we're talking about, the sort of day to day. We're talking about how those relationships in general feed forward and how they may influence somebody's life in the future. Not that everything that ever happens to you after childhood is your parents' fault. And I think that that's a important distinction for us to pull apart and tease apart right away. And we'll of course talk a lot more about that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Very, very crucial part of our entire podcast theme. So while the government was starting to realize that we really need to help these kids and parents, there was a concurrent shift in psychiatry. They started to realize that mental illness may be both hereditary and environmental, and that there is a significant environmental component and modification of a person's early environment, including childhood, could prevent some mental illness altogether. And this was a revolutionary concept at the time, and really hone in on children and how to be preventative. And then they thought about, well, where can we start with children? Where do we have children with the most trouble? And then they started looking at the juvenile justice system. In 1899, so this is still kind of late 1800s, early 1900s, they established the first juvenile court in Chicago. And this reflected some of the changes in the approach that society as a whole had towards juvenile delinquent children. And so they had started to think that it was not just about this child broke the law, but that there's something to an expression of psychological and socioeconomic stressors that then led to this child breaking the law. And so they had shifted from a punitive approach to a rehabilitative approach. And that was very, very important because it made us empathic. I think there was an empathy component that was added into this whole thing, that children, for the most part, are born trying to do good. They're really, really trying. And there's a lot of psychological, socioeconomic abuse stressors. And they had to respond and adapt in a way and steal food or steal money. And so there's a famous psychiatrist, William Healy, who wrote this work called The Individualized Delinquent in 1915 that stressed the importance of understanding each child as the product of the environment he or she was in. Again, kind of emphasizing that environment. He was part of a group that created one of the first child guidance centers. And so these centers emphasize listening to the child's own testimony, their own story, rather than just using facts gathered from sources, from police officers, from others to build the story of the child ending up in the system. One thing I want to really bring attention to is that the creation of the juvenile justice system is very complicated, and it actually coincided with the Great Migration, which was the influx of African American families coming from the South to northern states. And in a very unfortunate way, the juvenile justice system was used against vulnerable Black children.
I think, unfortunately, is a pattern we see a lot, that criminality is used as an excuse for people who may be coming from different circumstances, coming from different social backgrounds, different societal norms, different areas, different regions, to justify keeping certain people out, or trying to keep the status quo, trying to keep the same. And unfortunately, in this case, children were no exception to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's something we still struggle with very much today. And so I think this is why it's so important to look at history, is that you can, at face value, see something good happening, and yet there's just so much more behind that. So if anyone is interested in really reading more about this, there's an amazing book by, I'm going to butcher her name, but Tara Eva Agapon. and she wrote this book called Criminalization of Black Children. And there's a lot of good information there, I think, that can really open up your horizon about the juvenile justice system. So the child guidance movement, again, full-fledged movement by this point, really people started to realize that, okay, so there's homelessness, there's foster homes, and then there's the jail, and there's nothing in between. So what are we going to do with these kids who are kind of like maybe doing truancy and like not showing up to school, stealing school lunches, but not full-fledged committing a crime? So they came up with this idea of the residential treatment center. This was in the 1930s to 50s. And people started to realize that you really had to be preventative with these children who were ending up in the juvenile justice system, and that middle class, sort of troublesome, emotionally disturbed kids with behavioral disturbances, even like enuresis, temper tantrums, they had to also be taken care of.
Enuresis is bedwetting.
Yes. Yes,
And there is,
enuresis.
just so people know, there's a kind of normal spectrum where kids are not expected to have bladder control, but at a certain point, it's kind of expected that kids will learn how to do that and will learn to sort of hold their urine throughout the whole night. And there can be fits and starts, but kids who either persistently have enuresis, much longer than you would expect, or who attain bladder control and then lose it, that can be associated with medical problems, but can also be associated with trauma, can be associated with various psychiatric problems. So is something that we think about. Sorry, just consider me the asterisk and the footnote for
No.
medical terms like that.
No, it's great. It's great. Thank you for that. Yeah, we definitely want to define terms that are a little more of a jargon. So great. So they created these, we call them RTCs, residentials. You might hear them being tossed around. But so they created these residential centers. And again, I want to point out some flaws because I think it's important to recognize that these things happen. There was not as much of a collaborative effort between psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers. The roles were quite rigid. The psychiatrist would prescribe a medication. The psychologist worked with the child. The social workers worked with, resources in the family as a whole. It was very hierarchical and not ideal. That is not something that we strive for today. We really believe in a collaborative, integrative approach. It is the one thing that I really respect psychiatry as a field, child psychiatry as a field, because we really believe in that. It takes a village. It takes a village to care for a child, and you really can't escape that. So,
that couldn't be more true. Yeah, no one can operate in silos, and kids, and I would say adults, need that sort of collaboration and interdisciplinary care in order to be successful.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and so these residential centers actually started the idea of the therapeutic milieu. The therapeutic milieu is this concept that every interaction with a child, whether it's during mealtime or bedtime, some sort of routines, playing games, can all be therapeutic. And so this is, again, kind of very much different from the psychoanalytic tradition, which is that you sit down with the child, you delve into the inner psyche, the fantasies, the unconscious, and that's where the healing starts. Well, this is entirely different from that. They're saying every interaction the child has in his or their environment matters. And so it was quite a shakeup in the field because, over in Europe, Anna Freud, who is Sigmund Freud's daughter, and she was in Vienna, and Melanie Klein, who's also another dominant figure in child psychology development, Klein in London, they were both focused very much on this ego development and the internal workings of the mind. And there was a lot of debate between the two of them. This is in the early 1920s, 30s, about how psychoanalysis with the child can be effective. But over here in the United States, it's a little bit more different, where people started to focus a bit more on the environment. However, what's really interesting is historically, this is like the post-World War I time, before World War II. And so there was a lot of separation among families. And so kids were pulled away from fathers. There was a lot of breaking in the family as a unit. And so this was fertile grounds for psychoanalysis. And actually, a lot of residential centers started springing up, and it was a great place and time to study this sort of thing. So just kind of going into, I think it's important to understand some of the psychoanalytic thinking before going into attachment theory and John Bowlby. But so Melanie Klein came up with object relations theory, which also, if you are a trainee, a medical student, resident, fellow, these will be on your exams. So this is kind of a great way to remind what these concepts were about. So relations
if we could
theory.
highlight object relations theory, that you will definitely get questions on that.
Yes. And so what's the big deal with this? So the theory held that children's emotional issues were really based on fantasies generated from an internal conflict, including aggressive and libidinal drives. And so Sigmund Freud really focused on pleasure as a main drive. Melanie Klein, Anna Freud expanded that a little bit more and said that there more defense mechanisms and kind of other drives in that realm. However, all of them really did not focus on the external world. The child was entirely considered a separate entity from their environments. So John Bowlby, who came up with the idea of the attachment theory, he actually started working under Melanie Klein in London. And she actually forbade him from talking to the parent of a 3-year-old who was in psychoanalysis, because she thought it was irrelevant. And in fact, when the 3-year-old's mother had to be hospitalized, she was just annoyed that, nobody could bring the child into analysis. And that was the end of it.
And that's a big part of object relations theory and sort of how it's still thought of today and how it still moves forward. I mean, it makes Melanie Klein sound like a sociopath, and I don't think she is. I think that the way she saw the world is that children and adults create internal objects of external objects. So when they first meet a new person, when they first meet their mother, when they first meet anything, they bring that or the idea of that into their internal landscape, and they almost create sort of an artificial representation of that object. This, if you think of it that way, this can actually explain a lot about why people have so much trouble seeing when another person changes, because they're still relating to their internal object of that person, not the person themselves. It's a complicated theory, but it is very interesting, and it explains why once the child has already internalized their mother and the object of their mother, the actual physical mother is not as important, especially if you're doing psychoanalysis, because it doesn't matter if mom's in the room, in the hospital, in another country. The kid brings the mother with them with that object, so you can still do the psychoanalysis. So it's an idea that is complicated, and I do think that sometimes this is why psychoanalysts get reputations as being cold or uncaring, because it's true. You're dealing with the person kind of in isolation, not the person and their surroundings. And so a lot of instincts get changed in terms of relationships. And frankly, that's one of the reasons that I think psychoanalysis may have fallen out of favor in sort of a strict sense, because it doesn't deal with the external world in a way that we now think is very important and critical. But yeah, just as far as I know, I've never met Melanie Klein, but I don't think she was a cold, uncaring, sociopathic individual.
Right. No, that's a really great explanation. I think actually, yeah, that I can see how that is a start. That like thinking in that way is really a start. And, maybe it's just kind of the natural evolution of us learning more and more about child behavior that then you spread out into sort of, okay, what else can we do in the environment? But yeah, so safe to say, John Bowlby was dissatisfied.
Yeah.
And so he started to think about his own research. How can he contribute to this? How can he add different perspectives? And so he hired this very meticulous, excellent observer. James Robertson was someone who worked with Anna Freud over in Vienna at her residential center for homeless children. And he learned to observe these hospitalized and institutionalized children who were separated from families with very intense detail. In fact, Anna Freud, her records, required all staff, no matter their role, so from custodians to chefs to whoever, take note cards observing the children's behavior for hours, and then they would use them for weekly discussions. And so this is actually really important to highlight because I think as a field, we started to really use qualitative observations to our advantage. It's really hard to conduct research in a room in a sort of very controlled way with children. You really just have to watch them in their natural habitat and environment. And so people are starting to understand the importance of that. And so Robertson and John Bowlby put together a film called A 2-Year-Old Goes to Hospital in the 1950s. And this was truly groundbreaking. And I've actually watched the video. It is heartbreaking, but it's this 2-year-old who's in this hospital bed that has like rails, and she's crying and she's, saying, "Where's mommy?" And she's not willing to engage with the nurses. This really changed the way children were handled across the world in hospitals because they can have a profound impact on their emotional, mental, and physical health. So in 1951, Bowlby then, after kind of working through this for a couple of years, published a seminal work that highlighted the importance of a warm, intimate, and continuous relationship with a primary caregiver that is reciprocal. So I think this is really important to note that reciprocal relationship is really paramount. I think we often work with parents in our line of work, and there's a lot of parents that pause when we ask, "How did you feel when you first found out you were pregnant? What stage were you in your life?" And oftentimes there's fear, there's unpreparedness, there's anxiety, and so when the child is born, the relationship isn't as rewarding for the parent at times. And that's very situational. There's different circumstances surrounding that, but that without that reciprocity in that relationship, it can also really affect attachment without the parent's intent. This is, of course, unconscious. You want to do the best for your child at all times, but the impact is still there.
Yeah, and I think the idea that sort of the loss or the change in what a parent might expect versus the reality of having what I still think is the hardest job on earth. There is no harder job than being a parent. It's 24/7. You don't get a break. You're always there. And if you're at a hard job, you can go home and relax, or you can talk to someone about it, or you can vent about it. But there's this guilt around not being a perfect parent, not being a good parent. And it's almost this idea that you can't talk about how hard it is, how stressful it is, and how you're really trying your best. And all this kid does is cry and need or run away from you or say how terrible you are, or all of these things. And so reciprocal works in both directions. And so if we're talking about the parent's attitude and influence on the child, but the way the child behaves can also have an effect on the parent. And to not acknowledge that and to not talk about that, I think is a real detriment to the parent and to how difficult this is. And so we're not saying that yes, it's hard, but you need to buck up and do better to make sure that your child does well. We're saying that this is very difficult, and that that parents also deserve a space and an acknowledgement of how hard that is, and how even trying their absolute hardest sometimes feels like they're not good enough and they're not
Hmm.
doing what they need to do. And the idea, sometimes when in our line of work, when we see parents and families who come in with their child and the child's not doing well, yes, we'll start treatment, but we'll also talk to the parents about this is really hard. Like it's hard enough
Hmm.
to have a child who's straight A's and who's doing really well and everything seems to be headed in the right direction. It's twice as hard when your child is struggling. How can we help you take care of yourself so that you can be there for your child and you can be present and warm and all the things you truly want to be, but seem like they're a mile away.
Yeah. And with, this idea of the importance of the warmth being in that relationship, John Bowlby pointed out that society as a whole has a responsibility to contribute to the dependence of a parent to the society's economic provisions if the society wanted the child to depend on the parent in a healthy way. And so there's kind of a parallel process going on here. Again, with the welfare programs and the government funded programs, he kind of called them out and he said, well, look, if you want a healthy child and healthy parent child relationship, we got to give them support as a society, which I think was actually a pretty big statement to make at the time. So, just a couple of other, well, several other names that are important to know. Conrad Lorenz, if anybody has ever seen the video of the baby ducks
The
following the mama
ducks.
duck,
Yeah,
the ducks,
the famous ducks.
he came up with imprinting as a concept in 1935. And obviously, you imprint and you follow for food, shelter, provisions, security. But also, they realized that you could actually have a duck imprint on a non-duck, like a human being. And so, what's the logic in that? So, there was this idea that it's not necessarily tied directly to feeding. In fact, it is something to do with the bond that this duck is trying to make with another life. Again, kind of emphasizing the importance of observation, qualitative observational research. Then we have the tried and true, well respected Dr. Winnicott, Donald Winnicott. He came up with the Good Enough Parent and the transitional objects. He was out talking about this in the 50s, in 1950s. So really kind of concurrent with John Bowlby. It was a really great time for child development. And so he talked about, as Dr. Kelly mentioned, the sound, reasonable, and devoted instinct of a parent, leading to a child who is resilient in an imperfect world. So I think I have read somewhere, I actually can't recall, but the good enough parent, essentially you're looking for like 40% of the time. Like
Hmm.
you manage your child's distress and you attune to their needs 40% of the time. The stress is not necessarily a bad thing. It teaches a lot of skills. It's when we are consumed by guilt, shame, and that stress, that's when it's problematic. But stress on its own is not necessarily a bad thing. So Winnicott gave hope to mothers, fathers, parents around the world that it's okay to make mistakes.
Yeah, Winnicott was very interesting, and a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists did not like him at the time because he really did try to stride balance, and he was looking for balance in a lot of different things. Part of what he was saying was that everyone's doing their best and everyone's doing pretty okay. And yes, this can cause problems, but for the most part, most people are doing good enough. And that's really the goal is there's a sort of a threshold to reach. And then above that, you're fine to worry less. Now, that was to some extent in response to his perception that children were being overly pathologized and overly
Mm.
diagnosed at young, and every kid who has a bad day has a disorder. I think he also taught us as you said, a lot about stress, that the goal of raising children is not to put them in a bubble and protect them from everything. That the goal is for them to, you're raising adults, you're not raising kids. The goal is for them to be a fully functional adult, which means they've had to face stress and they actually grow from that stress. And they grow from some aspects of difficulty in their life. And there are lots of analogies. I don't know if it was him. I think he was the one who brought up the idea of the wine grapes, that when you're growing wine grapes to a certain extent, you want the soil to be a little bad and you want them to be stressed. It changes the quality of the wine, and that children actually sort of learn from that stress. And we know that that happens even on a biological level, that if kids are isolated from everything, their immune system has nothing to target and sort of goes into overdrive, and they can develop autoimmune conditions, they can develop asthma. So or pediatricians rather, sort of say a little bit of dirt is a good thing. You want your kid to get a little dirty, and so its immune system learns how to fight things. And so I think Winnicott was trying to bring things back into the middle, to say not every kid has a disorder, but there are some kids who do. And the idea of, you don't have to strive for perfection, you have to strive for good enough, frankly, I think is something we could all learn from a little bit.
Yes, yes. Any breaks that we can get, these days, with just everything going on in the world, really, to be kind to ourselves and gentle with ourselves. Actually, it's reminding me of one of the quotes that I've read from Winnicott that was just I found it to be really lovely. He said that in regards to hide and seek for children, that it's a joy to be hidden, but a disaster to be unfound. And I think he was just he was masterful at capturing these kinds of balance that you need in the approach to taking care of a child, is that there's playfulness, there's a little stress, there's a little tension, and then there's warmth, and there's repair if there's a rupture. And so these are kind of more modern terms, but I think he just captured a lot of that really well in his work. This is a great place to pause and pick up next time.
In all your lives, until we see each other again, take a bit of a lesson from Winnicott. Try to be kind to yourself.